Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI.
On this week's episode, we're joined by our colleague Mohammed Soliman, a senior fellow with the Middle East Institute. He focuses on the intersection of technology, geopolitics, and business. Mohammed's the author of the recently published book, West Asia, A New American Grand Strategy in the Middle East. In his book, Mohammed argues that the United States has an important role to play in building a new regional order across what he's termed West Asia, an area from the Middle East to South Asia, which connects Europe to the Indo-Pacific via the Mediterranean and Red Seas. What's required of Washington, Mohammed writes, is a fundamental shift in U.S. grand strategy. That brief introduction can't possibly do justice to all of the ideas that he's laid out in West Asia, but we look forward to drawing Mohammed out on at least a few of the big themes he delves into in his new book.
Our listeners can subscribe to Middle East Focus on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please check out MEI's other podcasts, Rethinking Democracy, hosted by Ganil Toll, and Taking the Edge Off the Middle East with Brian Katulis.
Mohammed, welcome back. It's great to have you on Middle East Focus again.
Long time no see, guys.
Indeed. So what motivated you to write this book? Where did the idea come from?
So I wrote West Asia when I was commuting between Washington and Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. I was not in Riyadh, I was not in Cairo, I was not in Abu Dhabi, I was not in one of the main capitals of the Middle East. I was in Jeddah, a city that I love and appreciate. And seeing, as you know, this is the gateway to Mecca, which is a very important place for Muslims. And seeing the sort of demographic fusion between South Asians, Middle Easterns, Europeans in the city, that was an extremely and deeply impactful thing on me, and the way that you see demographics and what does it mean for geography, what does it mean for our understanding of the modern region that we define as the Middle East. So that started my own journey writing West Asia. I started writing it in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah, and I think that gave me a bit more clarity, more of an interesting understanding of geography and demographics. And that led me to a lot of travel around that expansive region. So I spent time in Delhi, I spent time in the Arabian Gulf, spent time in Cairo and Turkey. So seeing those cities and the dynamics, that was the main impetus for the book. And until today, I was debating if West Asia should have been a travel writing or a strategy document, but here we are, it is a strategy manuscript.
How did your initial idea evolve over time? How did your thinking kind of change over the intervening years?
That's a very tough question. I did not come to the idea of West Asia recently. That has always been something deeply embedded in my understanding of maps as an engineer. I have a very diverse background. Like I say, I'm an engineer who became a policy professional, worked in tech, and now I'm working at a consulting firm, at a think tank, and I travel a lot. And I was deeply impacted by authors, intellectuals who wrote about that sort of theme of what was the shape of the global order before European hegemony. So you will see me referencing Janet Abulogd before European hegemony when she's talking about the multi-civilizational connectivity that existed specifically in between 1250 to 1350. And I'm building on that theme. I'm not inventing it at all. I'm trying to rediscover it in the 2020s and see, did we return to that system? Is it just a return to that system, or it's a bit different, a bit more expensive, a bit meets the 21st century moment? And I think the more I read into that sort of tradition and figuring out the engagements between the Mamluk states, the different societies in India, where the Arabian Gulf used to be, and the role of the British Empire, it was clear to me that we are on the cusp of a transformation that accelerated actually in the last five years. When you see the boundaries between Middle East, South Asia, Mediterranean truly collapsed, and you can tell that by the Saudi-Pakistan defense agreement, even though the relationship between Islamabad and Riyadh is not new, but this is interesting because it adds an institutional level. You see this in the United Arab Emirates' big bet on India, that relationship that now it's very much tied to trade, labor, capital, AI, infrastructure. You see this in India playing part in the Mediterranean Sea with its own engagement with Greece and Cyprus. You see this with Turkey playing a role with Bangladesh and Pakistan on a defense level, on diplomacy level. So those things, I think, were much more vindicating my concept of West Asia, that the old Middle East is not particularly the right geography length of how to understand the region. It does not explain Ethiopia today, doesn't explain Turkey's engagement in South Asia, does not explain India's engagement in the East Mediterranean. You have to have a much more expansive understanding of this region as a system that has multiple players and multiple orders that that are living side by side.
And that's kind of your logic behind using the term West Asia specifically here in reference, and of course in the title of the book itself.
Exactly, and I'm not one of the new people who are asking that question. Where's the Middle East? That has always been a question that people has been asking every 50 years. Um, Mahan himself, the American strategist, asked that question. I mean, where is the Middle East? And for him and for a naval strategist, it was this ambiguous region that could expand from the entire Mediterranean and Jebel Altar through Suez that secures the sea access to Singapore. This is a much more expensive way, of course, of looking into it. Or during the First World War and how the British Empire was thinking about its own positioning against the rival European powers and where to get resources, the deployment of the British Indian Raj forces against the Ottoman Empire in Iraq. So you already have that sort of expensive system, and you have all these sort of strategists are thinking about the region from a strategy and defense standpoint. And every 40, 50 years, you see an inflection point that basically forces people to rethink about the imaginary border of the Middle East and how should we define it.
Mohammed, within this broader region, broader system or order of West Asia, you present this India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, or IMAC, as sort of the central backbone of the entire concept. Um, why does it have that role? And maybe before you even answer that, just kind of tell us a little bit more. What IMAC is, why was it conceived? What is it? What are its objectives?
So the India Middle East Europe corridor was announced on the sidelines of the G20 summit that was hosted in Delhi under the India's presidency of the G20 group, and it was introduced by then President Biden, Prime Minister Modi, and the three leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So it was a very expensive initiative at the time, and that was right before the Gaza war. And the whole point was how to do economic integration between those sort of states. And the way to do it, at least as it was emphasized, it was through a corridor, multimodal corridor that includes uh, ship access, and then afterwards railway across the Arabian Desert, and then you link that system through the Levant to Greece, Italy, France, and to some extent Germany by mainland. And that corridor, when it was announced, it didn't really have much details to it. It was a concept, it was a high level, it was an MIU, it was a great idea, because so far, I would argue, America needed a geoeconomic project in Eurasia, and we did not have one. It has always been the Chinese at least are able to conceive an idea of a corridor. At least in their own case, it was the Belt and Road Initiative. Whether successful or not, partially successful or not, that's a different issue. But they were still able to come up with a vision for what a Chinese geoeconomic system would look like, and what's the role of Beijing that will play as a capital provider, as a builder, as a partner to those nations. We did not have that. For Europe, it was part of Europe's looking for a new geoeconomic orientation after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because Europe needed a new economic orientation. There's a whole decoupling from Russia around energy, around capital, around the institutional relationship between Russia and Europe that was built after the end of the Cold War basically collapsed. So what's the geoeconomic orientation of Europe? And I think I would argue in the book it is West Asia, and IMAC is extremely important to that part because that's where the growth is. It is in India, it's in Saudi Arabia, it is in Indonesia, of course, in Southeast Asia. This is where the energy is. This is, I mean, the role that Qatar, Egypt, and Algeria played into stepping in to support Europe when it comes to its own energy needs. So West Asia made sense for European policymakers in Berlin or Paris or Athens or Roma. And for the two Arab states who were participants, specifically United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, it was part of their own rise, right? I mean, a key theme of the book is the rise of the Arabian Gulf. And the rise of the Arabian Gulf, as I think about it, is how the Gulf became this sort of logistics node that's very indispensable globally to the global economy. You cannot go anywhere right now without any of the main airlines in the Middle East, in the Gulf. Qatar Airways, Etihad, Saudi Airlines, of course, Turkish Airlines. When you were thinking about maritime and ports and navy, sea-based commerce, it's Dubai ports. When you're thinking about capital allocators and capital providers for all these big technological bets, it's basically the sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf. So for them, that was part of their own DNA. This is the new Gulf. So it also makes sense for them. And then India. I think in the question of India, it is important to highlight India is looking towards an Asia minus China strategy. China is the big elephant in the room, and everyone was trying to find a breathing room around China and its own size and its own scale. And India is not in East Asia. It's not part of Southeast Asia. It's in a very interesting, very different geography. And to escape the South Asia geography, Pakistan and Bangladesh and Maldives, the India-Middle East Europe corridor provides India with this sort of strategic depth to go out of, I would say, the shadow of China that's looming over Asia.
You pointed out in your earlier response that IMAC was conceived, or at least announced to the world, in mid-2023. So within a few months before October 7th occurred and kind of reordered, shattered the order of the Middle East region. We talk a lot about ways in which the Middle East has been reordered since that time. A few years have passed, in the interim. How did these impact the West Asia trends that you had observed all along? And how do they affect the strategic projects that you propose vis-a-vis the region?
I think Gaza did accelerate the trends, accelerated the way South Asia and the Middle East and Mediterranean just right now acting as one system, acting as one big, expansive region. And you will see this when you go through the diplomatic visits between different states. You will see what I'm talking about here. Talks about a Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia agreement. Whether it happens or not, that's a different issue. But now you are thinking about that sort of minilateral organizations or minilateral formats emerging here and there. You see India, UAE, Israel. You see it within the ITU too. Yes, the IMAC itself is almost dormant, right? Because it's very much fixated on a Saudi-Israel normalization. And I think it's very fair to say that we are nowhere close to that sort of agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel. But let me say this. I am not married to a specific corridor or a specific minilateral. I even make the case that the Middle East or the old Middle East is an under-institutionalized region. We don't have institutions in the Middle East similar to the ones that we build in the Indo-Pacific or the ones that exist in Europe. It's a region that did not really have that sort of institutional muscle to bring all these different actors together. And we should treat the region as a region that's under establishment. We need to build a lot of minilaterals to cohere that region into a system. What I mean by that? I mean, you will have different minilaterals. Some of them will work, some others will not really work. And that's okay, that's fine. For American interest is you need to do try and error. And we have done this in the Indo-Pacific. We have done this with Quad, and that was our own initiative to figure out how can we work together with India, Japan, Australia, and figure out how should we think about the question of China in case of a Taiwan contingency. We figure out that this is not something that Delhi might be a bit hesitant to embrace, at least from a security standpoint or from a military standpoint. So we decided that let's shift to Philippines and do the Quad. So Australia, Japan, Philippines, and the United States. And I'm saying, let's use this playbook and bring this playbook to the Middle East. We did IMAC. Maybe it's dormant for now for different reasons, but it doesn't prevent us from embracing other miniature formats that bring different players who are willing to work together. For example, you have the back Celica, which is the latest initiative coming from the State Department and Secretary Rubio, that's bringing countries together to work across the silicon supply chain. And you have Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and Israel in the same miniature format. So clearly, we're also thinking differently, and we're trying to embrace this sort of uncertainty by being agile, by being innovative, by trying to figure out what's the right format.
Do you think that the Trump administration is likely to more closely embrace IMEC, or at least some similar, kind of cross transregional corridor idea as its vision for the region more broadly?
It seems to me from my conversations with American policymakers and officials in the current administration that this is something that they care about. And Miami will be hosting the G20 summit this year. And my understanding that we're going to have an IMEC conversations about the initiative, about how can we move this forward. So I do believe that, yes, the administration cares about the issue, will try to move this forward. However, will this lead to something material? This is a completely different conversation.
What are the big picture risks and opportunities presented by the sort of emerging West Asian order that you lay out?
My book is also a take on American grand strategy and what American grand strategy should be, what's actually American strategy is and should be, and how this American strategy should focus on Asia without being very deeply entrenched in the Middle East. And the biggest opportunity I see in West Asia is how can we work as conveners to build institutions that allow us to do more with less in the Middle East. I'm an engineer who cares about numbers. I care about maps. This is what I do on daily basis. And I want American foreign policy makers to understand that our resources are finite and we're very stretched. And we have to think differently about our own positioning in different regions. It's no surprise that we have a lot of concerns about where we are material-wise and scale-wise, ammunition and assets when it comes to Middle East, Iran, Israel, Ukraine, Russia, Taiwan, China. Clearly, and now we have Venezuela. Now we have Western Hemisphere. So it's no longer even three geostrategic spaces. We're speaking about four geostrategic spaces where America is operating in those spaces, and we are committed, right? So the biggest opportunity is how to build institutions that allow us to do more with less, free more resources, and allow us to move these resources to places that we need it. And again, sequencing and timing is like a very important pillars of any sort of grand strategy. I'm not talking about permanent withdrawal or anything. I'm just talking about what's the right size? How can we do this better? How can we be much more agile? How can this allow us to do an overarching objective? So this is basically where my book is coming from. I'm not pretending that this is the most important space. I'm very clear-minded about that. I'm arguing it's an important space for political reasons, for geostrategic reasons, but this is how can we do true Asia pivot and do more with less in the Middle East.
You note in the book that the U.S. should preserve its historically strong alliance architecture in the European and Asia-Pacific theaters. But in West Asia, you're proposing much more of a sort of looser, more fluid constellation of partnerships. Why do you think the U.S. should adopt a different approach, specifically in West Asia, and what accounts for that different from the other strategic theaters?
Excellent question and very difficult question to answer. The structural reasons that led to NATO and EU and the broader European project are completely different vis-a-vis the Middle East. And even the same thing applies to the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific, you're already in the post-Second World War reality, you're not even talking about Japan as a foreign power. You speak about Japan as a force multiplier for American power, as part of American power, Japan and Korea. And you were deeply invested from a structural standpoint, from an institutional standpoint, in East Asia, and that allowed the United States to do a lot of things on the security side, but most importantly on the techno-industrial side. And you can see this in the semiconductors, you see this in the cars industry. So those two different regions, Indo-Pacific and Europe, or Asia-Pacific and Europe, are different. Our own commitment to those alliances are very much a reflection of the realities of the two world wars that we fought and how we became resident powers technically in those two regions. The Middle East is absolutely different. Like I said, it's absolutely under institutionalized region. I mean, for example, there was a European project, and to some extent, America was not even receptive to this European project until it actually the Europeans proved that they can do that. Right? We don't have an integration or a project that we can call Middle East project that we can work with. That's not really the case, and I do not want us to be more committed. I really concerned about overcommitment. I'm really concerned about overstretch. I'm very concerned about finite resources and our strategic bandwidth, right? Every hour that State Department spends more here and there that are misallocated is a strategic loss. So how to work around that? So how can we solve this problem? You solve this problem by having much more loose coalitions, because again, we never tested that. I am arguing, let's test it, right? I'm not married to any coalition. I'm saying make multiple coalitions, see which one sticks, which one fails, which one is just dormant. And that's fine. That's okay. If overall, collectively, they can give us an overall objective of calm, stability, securing supply chain, energy supplies, even being force multiplier for different things that we care about, from AI infrastructure to logistics, that's good for us, right?
This ties into one of the other central points that you make in the book, which is about how the US needs to move from quote unquote nation building to order building. And I want to drill down on that in a little bit more detail, starting with the concept of offshore balancing. So maybe as a starting point for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you just kind of briefly explain what that is and how you see that as being relevant here?
So an offshore balancer only cares if a regional hegemon emerges in a sub-region, and this is where America should intervene to change that sort of balance of power. And it is kind of Kissingerian in its own nature, because it's very much a reflection of the role that the British Empire played in Europe, balancing between the different European powers for more than 200 years, trying to balance between the French and the Germans. And in the case of United States, people always say, well, but United States is an offshore balancer. I absolutely disagree with that. America is a resident power, is an entrenched power. You cannot have close to 800 bases and have 50,000, 60,000 American troops in the Middle East, one aircraft carrier group, and the president's talking about a second aircraft carrier group, and telling me that we are just offshore balancer that exist on the other side of the Atlantic. This is not really the case. Um, we have been a liberal hegemon. We cared a lot about the true nature of the political systems that rule different nations. Maybe this is the legacy of the Cold War and our understanding of American positioning. The idea that we're the indispensable nation and we have to intervene to protect norms. I mean, clearly this is no longer the case in 2026. We are in a global moment that's a bit different, and we have seen the famous or infamous speech by the Canadian Prime Minister Carney, when he said, "This is not a transition, this is a rupture." And yeah, this is a completely different moment in the global order, and the idea that America will be forever a liberal hegemon, it doesn't really even have domestic buy-in among the American voters. American voters cares a lot about working class, caring a lot about industrialization. I mean, there's a reason why there is support for tariffs, because people are some segments of the society still feel nostalgic about the era where Americans were able to produce what they consume in the 20s, 30s, 40s. So it's a completely different environment globally, with the rise of Asia, the rise of China, at the heart of Asia. But also the American political system has changed. The American electorate have basically has changed, and thinking differently about the American priorities. And I'm also trying to position my book as a book for the working class. It's a book that's also trying to make sense of what America is today, the identity of America today, and what are the objectives of this new America. America has changed. and we should not really treat America as if this is America of 1990s, 2000s, because this is no longer America. This America has completely changed since the 2010s.
Seems like there are some echoes of this grand strategic concept in the kind of newer strategic documents that the Trump administration has put out, namely the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. Do you see kind of through lines there? Do you think it aligns? What is your kind of take on how these two stack up?
I mean, the current administration seems to me more focused on securing resources for an era of war. Seems to me how they're thinking about it. That how can we secure more resources? How to domesticate a lot of industries? How to manage the trade imbalances? And this is not new to this administration, and this is not new to the American strategic discourse. I mean, the previous administration was also concerned with this, figuring out what should we do. Like every national security team will come to the White House, will have to contend with this idea. What America is, what's our DNA, what's our focus areas, how can we allocate our finite resources, what's our overarching goal? Is it an erosion bounds of power? Is it just containing China? Is it preventing China from taking over Taiwan? I mean, what exactly the overarching goal? And I think until today, I don't believe that we're able to answer that sort of question. I think if you ask different groups within the American foreign policy spectrum, what's the overarching objective? I think you'll find uh, a degree of disagreement over what this answer should be. Maybe 8 years ago, clearly it was China. Don't get me wrong. Maybe when Russia invaded Ukraine, the idea of expelling the Russians from Ukraine maybe was the consensus view. Right now, actually, I don't know. I truly do not know.
Switching gears a bit now, but shifting to a topic that is also very central to your book here. The AI revolution and the digital economy. How do these fit into your West Asia concept?
Every author will deny that he or she has a favorite chapter. But I did have a favorite chapter, and my favorite chapter was the Techno-Economic Coalition. And because I'm an engineer, I work on tech policy, and my first book should have been on AI infrastructure, but here I am talking about Middle East policy, and I loved it. And why is that? Because I do believe that compute infrastructure, AI infrastructure, is the backbone of a West Asian system. What I mean by that, when people think about AI, they think about models, they think about ChatGPT, they're thinking about how you're automating your daily task. When I think about AI, I think about infrastructure. I think about compute capacity through deployment of gigawatts of compute that we can use for automation, industrialization, national data analytics. And right now, you see that sort of compute infrastructure bringing and cohering that West Asian system together. You will see this, for example, in the way the United Arab Emirates is doing its own AI infrastructure. They are building AI infrastructure in France with Mistral AI. We're speaking about more than 1 gigawatt compute. They're building AI cluster, supercomputer in Italy, committing to build compute capacity in Greece. So the 3 European states on the Mediterranean. And everything you can imagine when it comes to India, UE AI partnership. So building AI cluster. The biggest Hindi LLM is being run and serviced from Abu Dhabi, integrating Indian technical universities in the United Arab Emirates, working together on internet cables between Al Fujairah and the Indian shores. So if you're asking me what's West Asia from a technology standpoint, it is this AI infrastructure that's taking place where the Gulf is the central node of this AI infrastructure and is acting as builder for AI, capital allocator for AI, as an inference center that's going to be servicing all these markets through the new gigawatts of capacity are being committed to build inside United Arab Emirates or the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and now Qatar.
Administrative reorganization is nothing new to the U.S. government. We've seen department bureaus rise and fall, with changing administrations, sometimes, even within the same administration. Do you think that the Department of State, the Department of Defense, do you think they should reorganize themselves and create kind of a bureau for West Asia? I mean, would that enable the United States to take a more focused policy approach toward this region?
When I started writing West Asia, I put myself on a plane and I went to Tokyo. And I spent about a week in Tokyo speaking with Japanese defense planners and strategists who worked with the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who, by the way, has a huge impact on the book. And you're going to ask me why a so-called engineer, Middle East analyst would go to Tokyo. I went to Tokyo because they have done the same exercise. They have done the same exercise when it comes to rebranding Asia-Pacific as the Indo-Pacific. That was the core of the Shinzo Abe doctrine, his own speech, Confluence of the Two Seas, or Majma al-Bahrain, that he gave in 2007 in Delhi, in front of the joint session of the Indian parliaments. And the core of it is, when you're changing the name, you're changing the perception of geography. But you need always a presidential buy-in. You need a top-down buy-in. And this is what Shinzo Abe understood, someone who understood the American system. And the way he went about it is the White House. It was the White House who came to understand, embrace, and act upon Shinzo Abe's Indo-Pacific, to expand the systematic definition of the Asia-Pacific as Indo-Pacific, to bring India to the geopolitical mix, to dilute the power structure, to make sure that you have more powers concerned with the question of Taiwan and what does it mean that you might have Chinese hegemony over the strait, but broadly speaking, over Asia. And when it comes to West Asia, I am basically arguing the same. I'm asking that should be a case to be made to the top officials, national security teams, who are concerned with the overarching views, because I want to treat this as a bureaucratic change in the State Department or the NSC, or fighting over which area of responsibility this West Asian system is. The moment you have a much more geopolitical understanding of this as a new national security team, I think it will create an incentive, a collective incentive, to figure out what's the right structure, what's the right institution. Because, by the way, there might be a case that there's no need to change the current institutional framework around the regions. Maybe you might have a czar, and instead of just creating a bureau, you might have just someone in the White House, his entire job or her entire job is cohering all these different initiatives, right? So this is basically my take. And also remember, and I have to be very humble here, I never served in the U.S. government. I'm an immigrant, and I'm trying to figure out the U.S. system myself.
Your book came out in early 2026, literally weeks ago. But you wrote your preface back in January 2025. So in light of the events of the past year, would you have changed anything in what you wrote if you were to draft it today?
I am very proud of the manuscript as it is. I think I tried to write a manuscript that's very ambitious in scope, in the regions it covered, in the strategic case that the book is making to the readers. And I believe that the structural imperatives that I'm talking about in the book is staying correct. You see this with, I'm saying in the book that South Asia, Middle East, and Mediterranean Sea basically became one big system. And I think that was very evident with Saudi Arabia-Pakistan defense deal, very evident with the UE, India engagement, I would say partnership, strategic partnership. It's very evident when it comes to Greece engagement in the Mediterranean Sea. You can also see that on trade, right? I mean, forget about geopolitics, let's talk about trade. A few days ago, or last week, we had the India-EU trade framework. The India-EU trade volume is basically 125 billion euros, I think. The trade between India and the United Arab Emirates is $100 billion, will go up to $200 billion, doubled in less than 6 years. The trade between India and Saudi Arabia is about $42 billion that will actually be doubled in the next 4 or 5 years as well. So the numbers as they stand today between India and two Gulf states is more than $140 billion, more than the entire trade between India and the EU. And this is a very fascinating fact, that you see this trade cohesion, the volume, the numbers speak out loud, more than pictures, more than MIUs. You see this in the Indian workers in the Gulf. You see this in the India is playing more of a defense role, a security role than before. That was never the case before. And in the meantime, Russia's not there, right? India's playing a part. India is there partnering with Israel, working with Israel on defense ties, working with Greece, working with Cyprus. Meanwhile, that one country that captured the attention of people is not there. Yeah, we can talk about Russian tourists in in the Middle East, but I don't particularly believe that this is the manifestation of Russian power in the region. You see a different rethinking on the leadership level of how they define the region. The very idea that those sort of trips, presidential trips between Delhi and the Gulf, basically the new norm, is a very interesting indication. The very idea that all these capitals or all these leaders are always in the Horn of Africa, in Addis Ababa, in Somalia. The president of Somalia basically now a regular visitor to Cairo, or vice versa. So this is the new region. This is the new reality. I mean, I think the Middle East as a construct has ended, and now we are dealing with West Asia, and we see it in front of us.
Mohammed, zooming out and focusing on these trend lines that you've identified in the book, where do you see the region going moving forward over the next year, over the next decade?
My book, West Asia, is about the story of two Middle East that exist in the same space. And there's almost decoupling between the Middle East and North Africa. You're going to have Egypt in between, acting as a country that both sides because of geography and demography. But you're going to see North Africa much more integrated with African dynamics. You're going to see Morocco deeply involved in the geopolitics and economics of West Africa. You'll see Egypt playing a bigger role in the Horn of Africa, specifically in Somalia and, of course, Sudan. And you will see the Gulf Asianized. And there's a chapter in the book when I talk about the Asianization of the Gulf. And this is core to the rise of the Gulf, that the Gulf is becoming much more Asian, based on trade, based on demographics, based on geopolitics, based on security, on aspirations. When you talk to Gulf policymakers, they will say Singapore is a model they want to imitate. I mean, this is the whole intellectual concept behind Dubai as a model. So you're going to have the Gulf is going to be part of a broader Asian system that's much more coherent and integrated around the Asian rimland, from East Asia to West Asia. And this explains a few initiatives. This explains the Gulf, the GCC ASEAN summit. This explains the engagement with India. Explains the strong relationship with India, with Indonesia. I mean, the news just broke that Indonesia might be deploying forces in Gaza. That's interesting, right? So the point that now there's an Asian system. And this is an Asian system that exists beyond the question and beyond the shadow of China. Because one of the things I keep saying here in Washington, don't keep thinking about West Asia or the Middle East through the obsession of China. All these countries are also trying to figure out what Asia minus China strategy looks like. It's not if everyone is happy to be under Chinese hegemony. No one really is happy about that. Also, people want independence and want different players. Everyone wants optionality. So if they're able to figure out equation with everyone else that's not China, that's helpful for them. And by the way, that shouldn't angry us. This is actually a good development, because as long as it's a network of states rather than one hegemon, that in itself helps with our own overarching strategic position as a country that's in the Western Hemisphere.
One final question for you. Where can our listeners find your book?
You can find West Asia on Amazon. Order a copy today.
That's all the time we have for this week, so we'll have to leave things there. Mohammed, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you, guys. Looking forward to be back again soon.
A warm thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in, as well as to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of regional dynamics in the Middle East, please visit our website, www.mei.edu. You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.